In part 1, we saw that Lisette Schaeffer, a 90-year-old woman, was murdered in Sanremo in 2001, leaving around 10 million euros in cash and assets in various countries. We saw that her brother, Oswald Schäfer, who was 2 years older than she was, studied to become a lawyer and then got a job with the Reich Security Main Office, and how his career was propelled by Werner, who was second in command to Reinhard Heydrich. This led Oswald Schäfer to becoming the head of the Gestapo at Wesermunde, Bremehaven, and then in Reichensberg in occupied Czechoslovakia, before being sent to the east to mass murder Jews and others in the occupied Soviet Union as the commanding officer of Einsatzkommando 9. We take up this story in the spring of 1942, when Oswald Schäfer was posted away from Einsatzkommando 9 to take up a new position in Munich. From the 20th December 1941 to the beginning of February 1942, Schäfer was a substitute inspector of the security police and the SD in Munich, although this job had to wait as he was in the occupied Soviet Union murdering people. However, shortly after his return, Schäfer was appointed head of the Munich Gestapo Control Center by the Reich Security Main Office in March 1942 and held this position until 1945. This move was clearly a promotion for Schäfer, head of the Gestapo in Germany's second most important city. One of the duties of the Gestapo was to oversee the arrest and deportation of Jews. As far as Schäfer and the Munich Gestapo were concerned, the following was the procedure. The Gestapo forced Munich's Jewish community to assist with organising the transports. A card index with the names and addresses of all Munich's Jews existed in triplicate at the Aryanization Department, the office of the Jewish community, and at Munich's Gestapo headquarters. This index was used to assemble the different transports. The Gestapo determined the criteria of the transports based upon age, ability to work, and other factors. About a week before the planned transport, the Gestapo instructed the Jewish community to inform the victims of their forthcoming evacuation to Theresienstadt. The community had to finance the transports, provide food for the deportees, and pay helpers to deal with the luggage. 1 or 2 days before the deportation, the deportees who were not yet living in the Milbertshofen assembly camp were picked up from their apartments by the Gestapo in large closed removal vans and taken to the assembly camp. This usually took place during the night or in the early morning. At Milbertshofen, they stayed for a day or two. They were searched and their last valuables were confiscated. The deportees had to endure bureaucratic procedures and undergo the final stages of expropriation. Their declarations of property were collected, and they were informed that because they were enemies of the Reich, their assets had been seized. On the day of deportation, they were woken up and they had to leave the assembly camp at Milbertshofen in the morning. Every transport was accompanied by Gestapo members and members of the uniformed police. Closed furniture trucks or buses were used to transport the Jews approximately 10 kilometers from the assembly camp to the train stations where the transports headed for Theresienstadt. Trains left either directly from Munich Central Station or the freight train station located at Munich Lahm. At the station, one passenger car awaited them. The deportees were ordered to board the train, usually around 9 in the morning. If it left from a goods depot, the train went to Munich Central Station. Here, the car was connected to a regular, scheduled passenger train that left Munich every day at around 12 for Marktredwitz via Moosach, Freising, Landshut, Regensburg and Schwandorf. At Marktredwitz, the car was connected to other trains going to Eger, Karlove Vary, then Karlsbad, and Ustin nad Labem, then Aussig, to Bohusowice, then Bauschowitz, where it finally arrived the day after departure. The deportees were taken off the train at Bohusowice station and forced by the awaiting SS personnel and Czech gendarmerie to walk the approximately 3 kilometers to Theresienstadt carrying their backpacks. Only people who were unable to walk were taken in trucks. To take one example, on the 2nd of July 1942, 50 people were sent to Theresienstadt. The transport consisted of 50 elderly Jews, the majority being female. All of them had lived in the Milbertshofen assembly camp prior to their deportation. None of them survived. The two most elderly people on this deportation were Rosalie Obenbreit and Isidor Nödlinger, both born in 1866. Therefore, they were 76 years old. I do not know the fate of Rosalie Obenbreit, but I do know what happened to Isidor Nödlinger. From Theresienstadt, he was deported on Transport BO train DA83 from Theresienstadt to Treblinka on the 19th of September 1942. If he survived the journey, he would have been murdered in the gas chamber on arrival. At the beginning of September 1942, Schäfer was promoted to SS Obersturmbannführer. He was also a criminal and senior government councillor. During the summer of 1942, leaflets from a resistance group called the White Rose started to appear in Munich. After the disaster at Stalingrad, a huge amount of leaflets were found, and Schäfer ordered Criminal Secretary Robert Moore to stop whatever he was doing and concentrate on finding the culprits. Very soon, on the 18th of February 1943, the siblings, Sophie and Hans Schürl, together with Christoph Probst, were arrested. Moore spent 3 days interviewing Sophie Schürl, who gave her full confession, so much so that when she was put in front of the People's Court on the 22nd of February 1943, no witnesses were required. Presumably, Moore was reporting directly to Schäfer throughout these interrogations. I've done a separate video on Schäfer's subordinate Robert Moore, who interrogated Sophie Schürl, and there'll be a link to that below. In March 1944, a group of Allied POWs escaped from Sargen POW camp in Lower Silesia. Gestapo and police officers throughout Germany were warned to be on the lookout for escaped prisoners. Eventually, nearly all of them were caught. On Saturday the 25th of March 1944, the Munich Kripo, the criminal police, received a telex warning that everyone had to be on the lookout for the men. There was also information about the escape and the suggestion that they would be in civilian clothes with false papers. At Munich, the criminal police officer assigned to the task was Anton Gassler. His idea was to concentrate the search on the railway stations, and this quickly produced results. Switzerland was a natural destination for the escapers, and most roads to Switzerland would have gone through Munich via train. The first escaped officer to be picked up was arrested near Donauwörth on an express train. The prisoner spoke very good German and made a positive impression on his captors. He asked Gassler what would happen to him. Gassler said he'd probably be sent back to the POW camp, but that was not a decision for him. The prisoner was returned to Sargen. The next two to be caught were both officers from the South African Air Force. They were Flight Lieutenant Rupert Stevens and Flight Lieutenant Johannes Hayes. I believe that Hayes is the correct pronunciation. I don't speak Afrikaans, but Hayes is actually spelled G-O-U-W-S. One was caught on a train near Kaufbeuren, the other on a slow train near Rosenheim. They were both brought to prison in Munich on or before the 28th of March 1944. The investigation of these men was taken from the criminal police to the Gestapo. That in itself may not be as nefarious as it sounds. At the end of the day, the Gestapo were probably doing the investigations into these men. However, later in court, it did prove to be quite significant. On the night of the 29th of March 1944, Schäfer received a teleprint with the Hitler order to kill any Allied POWs who were recaptured. It was after duty hours and he sent his car to collect some of his staff. The car returned with the second in command, Martin Schirmer, as well as Eduard Geit and Johann Schneider. They were joined by Emil Weil, who was the duty officer. Weil was in a particularly difficult situation. He was 1/4 Jewish and a Gestapo officer. Had Schäfer found out, his fate would have been the same as for any other Jew in Munich. After a short conference with his second in command, Schäfer summoned the others and explained to them that on orders from the Reich Security Main Office, the 2 captured British prisoners held at Kripo headquarters were to be shot. He briefed them in accordance with the Hitler order. It was decided that Schneider, who had a Soviet submachine gun which he'd brought back with him from the Eastern Front, and because of his experience there did not mind doing the shooting, should kill the men, and that Schirmer should be put in charge of the party and give the order to shoot. All participants were pledged to secrecy by clasping of hands, a gesture associated with men about to go into battle. Once the procedure had been decided upon, the men got some rest for an hour or two. How they managed to do this before committing murder is beyond me. The prisoners, of course, had to be interrogated as per orders. That began at around 4 in the morning, but none of the 4 Germans spoke any English, and only one of the prisoners knew a few phrases in German. It seems as though the POWs told them their route through Germany and how they attempted to get to Switzerland. After about an hour, they were strip searched, the Gestapo being at pains to do this in a dignified manner in a warm room where the prisoners would not get cold. The prisoners were handcuffed and placed in the car in the forward-facing seats at the back. Weil and Geit sat in the folding seats opposite them. Schneider drove and Schirmer sat in the passenger seat. They were driven up the motorway in the direction of Ingolstadt for around 45 kilometers. At around 6 in the morning, they were told to get out and urinate. Schneider took his Soviet machine pistol, which was under the passenger seat, and inserted a magazine. He told Schirmer to get out of the way and then shot the prisoners. One appeared to be still alive and he had to fire again. Having committed the murder, the 4 then made it look as though the prisoners had tried to escape by collecting the spent rounds in the forest and firing their pistols at trees to simulate a chase. 2 policemen approached and asked what was going on. The Gestapo officers flashed their passes and told them that everything was under control. Sometime later, a doctor and a coroner appeared and, accepting the story of the Gestapo officers, agreed that there was nothing further to be done. The bodies were left in the care of one of the policemen, whilst the Gestapo officers returned to Munich with the now dead prisoners' effects, which were handed over to Schäfer. One effect was an unopened packet of cigarettes. Schäfer said to Geit that he may as well smoke them, and so they shared them amongst themselves. The prisoners also had some cash on them. Part of this cash was used to pay for their bodies to be burned in the municipal crematorium. Had the bodies been burned at Dachau concentration camp in the crematorium there, then there would have been no charge, and thus no paperwork. This snippet of information allowed later British investigators to trace what had happened to the pilots, and eventually to catch some of those involved in the murders. 3 years later in court, Schneider's defence was that he had thought that the 2 prisoners were looters and desperados. Geit's defence was that he did not hear the orders given by Schäfer at the conference. Weil, whilst admitting that he'd heard Schäfer's orders at the conference, thought that the prisoners had already been tried by a tribunal and convicted. The Gestapo operated a prison, and Schäfer, as head of the Munich Gestapo, was responsible for it and what happened there. Surprisingly, not all descriptions of the Munich Gestapo prison are bad. The Gestapo was based in the former home of the kings of Bavaria, the Wittelsbacher Palace. This palace, a red brick building, was constructed between 1843 and 1845 and first used by Bavarian King Ludwig I after his retirement. It was then the home of his successor Bavarian kings. Ludwig III was the last to use it. He fled after the revolution in November 1918, and the Munich Soviet briefly took over the building. The Gestapo moved in October 1933. Shortly afterwards, Heydrich ordered that a prison be built. This prison had 3 floors, was modern for its time, and was connected via a passage to the main building. The prison even housed a number of British people such as Channel Islander John Finkelstein, who was kept in a 3rd-floor cell in solitary confinement from the 8th of October 1943 until his transfer to Buchenwald on the 29th of October 1943. The following year, fellow Channel Islander Kingston Bailey described the prison thus: "All around were high walls, and on one side of the yard, the prison building, badly damaged from recent bombing. In fact, one side of the building was completely burnt out. After much yelling, shouting and counting, we were at last marched into the prison, which was the usual cold, bare and granite-built prison of Germany." The cells were much more comfortable than I had expected. They were warm and each had its own flush lavatory. The floor was covered with brown linoleum. They were built to hold 2 men. There were 2 beds which let down from the wall, and there was also a small table with a seat on each side. We were 4, so 2 had to sleep on the floor. I was one who slept on the floor and was supplied with a mattress and 2 blankets. The food was much better at Munich. Again, this was very surprising considering the state of the city. The quantity was small, but good. Breakfast consisted of the usual bread and ersatz coffee, dinner stew, but without meat, and on one day a pudding substitute like custard. The tea was usually bread, margarine and jam or cheese, sometimes a small piece of sausage or potato salad with substitute tea. There was no work to do, and we remained always in the cell, except during an air alarm when we proceeded to the basement cellars. There were 2 very heavy bombardments when I was in Munich. The first lasted for several hours. The cellars were damp and cold and very overcrowded. There were prisoners of every nationality of Europe. It was very rare for prisoners to be given access to air raid shelters during bombing, so this does suggest a degree of understanding not normally shown by the Gestapo. As it happened, the Gestapo was right to evacuate their prisoners, as the building was eventually destroyed in a bombing raid. It would appear that Schäfer was doing such a good job of arresting people that the facilities he had for imprisoning people were insufficient by the summer of 1943. In August 1943, the commandant at SS Straflager Dachau was ordered to make 53 of his cells available to Schäfer as head of the Gestapo in Munich in order to accommodate 90 of his prisoners. This would have led to overcrowding of the remaining cells, and the matter went as far as Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who then headed the RSHA. Kaltenbrunner's answer was that the cells were needed by the Munich Gestapo, and the prisoners who were already at SS Straflager Dachau then had to be squeezed into the remaining cells. If they complained or offer resistance, then they could be shackled. The war did not go the way the Nazis would have wanted it to go. This film shows the liberation of Munich on the 30th of April 1945. However, there were German units that had attempted to liberate Munich before the Americans got there. On the 27th of April 1945, Captain Ruprecht Gerngoss, chief of the interpreter company of Wehrkreis 7 in the Tsar barracks in Munich, attempted a rebellion. On the evening of the 27th of April, Gerngoss ordered his troops to line up at the Tsar barracks. He released the soldiers from the oath of allegiance to the Führer. The following day, Gerngoss and his comrades in arms occupied 2 transmitters in Munich from which they called for a cessation of all hostilities and proclaimed the goals of the Freedom Action Bavaria. Attention, attention, you are listening to the radio station of the Freedom Action Bavaria. Get rid of the functionaries of the National Socialist Party. The Freedom Action Bavaria has taken power tonight. Unfortunately, it was not to be. Nazi authorities were still in command, and the SS and Gestapo cracked down on the Freedom Action Bavaria. Gerngrosner's men had to flee. The SS managed to capture some who were murdered. Other revolts occurred in Augsburg, Dachau and Penzberg. In the former two, the revolts were successful. Nonetheless, the Americans kept on advancing. If anything, these revolts might have hastened their advance by diverting SS and Wehrmacht from the front line. Munich was where Adolf Hitler had a private apartment. It was here that Hitler had emigrated in 1913 from Austria, here where he had joined the Bavarian army in World War I, where he had joined the German Workers' Party, here where he had taken control of the Nazi Party, here where he had led a putsch against the German government, and it was here that he probably considered his hometown. Munich was very much the cradle of Nazism, and that was why it was so urgent for the regime to destroy the White Rose. Berlin might have once been red, but Munich was always brown as far as the Nazis were concerned. Hitler expected every man to die fighting for Munich. He didn't get his wish. On the 29th of April 1945, US troops approached Munich encountering light resistance. They entered the city the following day without encountering any significant resistance. As can be seen in this newsreel, the locals welcomed their liberators. Around 1 hour after Hitler committed suicide in Berlin, Munich Town Hall was surrendered at 16:05 hours. The highest-ranking Munich National Socialists, such as the Gauleiter Paul Giesler and the mayor Karl Fehler, had shown their support for the fighting to the last breath for their Führer by running away. There had been heavy street fighting in Nuremberg, but not in Munich. The liberators were welcomed with flowers by the locals. In order to celebrate, some Americans popped into Hitler's private apartment on Prince Regentsplatz and helped themselves to whatever they could. Other Nazi targets and warehouses were also looted, not only by the soldiers, but also by the locals, now freed of their Nazi overlords. Some Munich residents now demonstratively presented themselves as Bavarian patriots. The white and blue flag of Bavaria hung from many windows, and discarded Nazi Party devotional items lay on the streets. This marked the end of the Nazi era in Munich. The Supreme Commander of the Western Allies, General Eisenhower, then noted in his order for the day, "The entire Allied force congratulates the 7th Army on the capture of Munich, the cradle of the Nazi beast." By the end of the war, 90% of the historic Old Town and 50% of the city as a whole had been destroyed in 73 air raids. Over 6,000 people died in air raids and around 15,000 were injured. The number of Munich residents who died in the Second World War is estimated at least 33,000. As a result of evacuation and flight, the population fell from 824,000 in 1939 to 479,000 immediately after the war. Munich was part of the American occupation zone. On the 4th of May 1945, Karl Scharnagl was reinstated as mayor of the city by the American occupation forces. On the 15th of May 1945, a staff of 32 American officers arrived in Munich. In the following months, their number rose to around 200. Under the leadership of Charles Keegan, they formed the expanded US military government in Bavaria, called the Regional Military Government. The goals were to rebuild an administrative structure, take measures to reorganize everyday life, provide supplies to the civilian population, and oversee denazification measures. As the American tanks came into Munich, Oswald Schaeffer did what any die-hard Nazi would do. He fled. Josef Acta, a former Gestapo officer, was held after the war in an American internment camp. Whilst British and American investigators were trying to track down the criminals responsible for the Great Escape murders, Acta was asked about Schaeffer. He didn't know where he was, but he said that he'd heard from Schaeffer's deputy that the former Munich Gestapo boss was last seen heading south on a bicycle on the 29th of April 1945. He was believed to be hiding somewhere in the Tyrol. Acta said that he thought that Schaeffer's family was then living in a village near Prien. Prien is on Chiemsee, not so far from Berchtesgaden. This was not a very wise place to hide, given that search activities for former Nazi criminals were likely to be quite intensive in this area. Where exactly he was, I don't know. Now aged only 36, he faced a very uncertain future. As a lawyer, he would have realised that he had committed criminal acts and that he could, or more to the point, would face the death penalty. In part 3, I shall look at what happened to him after the war and discuss more on the fate of his sister.